It's my pleasure to welcome you today, particularly because today is English Language Day, 658 years since on the 13th of October, the Chancellor of England opened Parliament in English for the first time, something that led to what's known as the Statute of Pleading. My fellow trustees are hidden amongst the Zoom ranks somewhere: Christopher Mulvey, Marcus Barrett, and Nick Lodge. And I can see the names of many of our friends. Big welcome to you, and many names I don't recognize, so a special welcome to you tonight. If you're not a Zoomer and you've not been Zoom bombed or zoomed out or whatever you associate with the technique of Zooming, here are 4 quick things that you might like to know. 1, when David Crystal starts speaking, please remain on mute. I think everybody is on mute at the moment. It's really important so that David doesn't get distracted by sounds of phones or coffee, or embarrassing for me recently when one of my cockerels started making a racket outside. 2, during David's talk, please use the chat function. If you're new to Zoom, it's at the bottom of the screen, and just click on it and you can start to air your thoughts and frame questions, which I'll be using when David's finished for a question and answer session. If you would like to see whoever's speaking in full glory, then go to the top right-hand side of your screen and press Speaker View. That'll mean that whoever's speaking enables you to be, they will be large rather than one small little rectangle. And finally, if something peculiar happens, like the internet goes down, that's life. It will just happen. And if that does happen, then disconnect yourself and reconnect yourself. The worst that can happen is that the internet has gone down in my home, which means that you'll all have to reconnect. And my apologies in advance were that to happen. Now, one person has just, I'm just going to mute John, thank you. Just to give you the shape of the evening, in a few minutes, I'll introduce David, and then we'll have the pleasure of David talking to us for 45 minutes, whatever he feels moved to spend, whatever time he feels moved to spend with us. During that time, you'll be sharing your thoughts in the chat function. I'll be looking very carefully. And then when David draws breath, we'll enter a conversation with him, which I'll facilitate using your comments in the chat function. So now's the moment where I need to just remember to press the record button. So I'm just going to do that now, and we're recording. So let me, with great pleasure, introduce our very, very special guest and friend, Professor David Crystal, a world-renowned authority on language, English language, known for his many authoritative books on the subject. And most recently, not all of you may know this, and if you can see in small, you'll see a latest foray into what David refers to as a pseudo-autobiographical novella. That's the tease. You need to get your own copy. It's the perfect Christmas present if you are looking for an intriguing read. David is, most importantly to us, and we're hugely grateful to him, president of the English Project, our inspiration. And it's my very, very great pleasure to introduce David now, who is going to talk to you about the new normal for global English. David.
Well, thank you, Bill. Now, first thing to check, am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. Very glad to hear that you've done the muting exercise so efficiently. I was doing an exercise like this to India the other day, and halfway through, I swear, a cow started to moo, and then another one. And in some house somewhere in India, obviously it was milking time or something like that. So cockerels, no problem. Oh dear, yes, but I'm not expecting any mooing this evening or this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. That's the other thing about Zoom, isn't it? You and I are in the evening here, but people could be anywhere at any time. Even good night, perhaps, to some people in some parts of the world. And this is part of the new normal for global English. Yes, we are going to start with the English project. I shall end with the English project. It's been a delight to be part of this project. It's the most important language project this country has got, it seems to me. And I'll explain why as we go along, because many of my examples relate to that. New normal. Yes, it's one of the phrases, isn't it? The lexicographers, and the newspapers and so on are going to be in real trouble at the end of this year. You know, every year there is a word of the year that dictionary writers like to present, and the newspapers pick it up. It's funny, isn't it? It's always word of the year. You never get sort of grammatical construction of the year or pronunciation of the year or spelling of the year. It's always word of the year. Anyway, normally it's not too difficult to find one that stands out from all the others, but oh gosh, this year it's going to be terrible, isn't it? Because all the words you used in announcing this talk and all the words that we're so familiar with now, like social distancing and self-isolation and all of these, dozens of them come with new vocabulary to talk about the pandemic. Which one is going to be word of the year? Or at least, you know, there are probably going to be several as different. Nobody wants to have the same word of the year as everybody else, you see. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And all over the world, linguists, of course, and lexicographers in particular, have been collecting these things. Now, there are two types of collection, and I'm not going to talk this evening about the kind of serious vocabulary that is part of the new normal. That's all going to get into the dictionary in due course. What I'm going to illustrate first, some of the less predictable kinds of things, the words that are coming into the language but are nonce words. They're words that probably will never get into the dictionary. Maybe some of them will, but they're there because of a phenomenon that has been with English, and I suppose all languages for as long as anybody can remember, and before that, where people invent words, create words, they coin words. Neologisms is the kind of technical term for when they enter the language. Nonce words is another term, words that are introduced for the nonce, just for the one occasion. And I've been collecting these, as have linguists all over the world, actually. I know of several linguists who have been doing the same sort of thing. At the same time as the serious vocabulary arrived, and despite the awfulness of the situation, people began to coin playful or imaginatively surreal expressions that captured the character and the effect on our behavior of the virus. In the traditional wartime spirit, I suppose, of laughing in the face of adversity. And I've looked at some of the collections that people have been making, and of course I've got one of my own, and several have been invented more or less simultaneously, I imagine, all over the English-speaking world. I say English-speaking world, I imagine the same sort of thing's been going on in other languages, but I don't know that for a fact, but maybe some of you will have some examples later. And these coinages, these new forms, they're all based on the standard vocabulary. Words like corona and COVID and quarantine and isolation and Zoom and so on. And so to take examples that I've seen all over the world now, people talk about corona dancing or corona dodging when they're walking towards somebody on the street. And so you avoid too close contact, or COVID dancing or COVID dodging. You know, I mean, there's a lot of synonymy taking place here. Or words like L-bump, you know, rather than handshaking, or Blur's Day, a lovely coinage based on Thursday when you have no idea what day of the week it is. Or upperwear, which you see Bill and I and everybody else using now. You see the upper part of us. You have no idea what we're wearing down below. Bill is probably wearing his pajamas. I don't know. That's the sort of thing. These are the terms that are coming in. Corona cut for a haircut that's made during the virus because you can't get to the hairdresser, or a COVID cut when you do it yourself and the results are awful. Some of these things are very, very ingenious. Here are some of my favorites, and you'll have your own, I'm sure. I was very taken with carooning. Carooning, that's singing to others online, based on crooning, of course, carooning, or in the street, because actually I've noticed you have some professional singers are out there doing some songs every now and again. A nun sent me a lovely one from her convent. She talked about Coventine, which was a quarantined nunnery, which Shakespeare would have loved that one, I have no doubt. And then people being sent to Covidentry, not Coventry, Covidentry. In other words, you're made to leave a social group because of a fear that the person has the virus. You know, that kind of thing. There are some lovely ingenious ones. Isolation has generated a fair number of really clever ones. You may have been subject to isodesking, for instance. That's, you know, when you have a desk at work or at home, that's 2 meters or 1 meter plus or whatever your norm is away from everybody else. Isolocks, that's the result of the growth of hair resulting from the inability to go to a hairdresser. These are real terms. Let me prove it to you. Isolocks, I mean, come on. Have you ever seen anything like that before? This is the new normal for Crystal. No shadow of a doubt there. And then people get surreal, you know, science fiction-y almost. I came across the other day iso creams. And what's that? Well, that's the possibility that one day there are going to be ice creams fitted with an edible app that would warn you if you're getting too close to somebody else eating them. True? False? Well, who knows? We know anything can happen in this day of world. And of course, associated with that was the concept of lick down. That's a ban on offering your ice cream to anybody else, you see. Lick down, very good, I like that one. And then all the words that have come in relating to quarantine. Oh, dozens, aren't there? Quarantinium, quarantini, for the drink you might have at the end of the day, or if you don't drink at all or have stopped drinking, you're quarantitotal. So all based on the core pronunciation elements in the word and then stretching them in new directions. Lovely, ingenious ones. I remember quarantini. That's an infant no longer able to go to a creche or a nursery school. And quaranteenager. There can be nothing more fearsome, can there? A quaranteenager. Some of them have more than one meaning. That's an interesting development. I was expecting most of these things to have just the one meaning, you know, they're monosemantic. But I've started to notice that some of these terms are developing multiple meanings. One that I saw the other day, I noticed quarantine based on guarantee, you see, current, I don't know how you pronounce it, guarantee or quarantine. Anyway, spelt like guarantee, you see, but with a Q at the beginning, which referred to a promise, you know, any promise made by the government or some organization to do something to help people during the quarantine period, you know, financial loss or what have you. And then the other day, I heard somebody use it in relation to golf, you see, quarantine, the first drive in golf where the golfers have to maintain social distancing. Oh gosh, yes. And then I heard, of course, quarantine with T-E-A at the end, quarantine time. And so a whole cluster of words developing there in relation to one original one. Old patterns are resurfacing. I wasn't expecting any rhyming slang, for instance. You all know about rhyming slang associated with cockneys and so on and so forth. You know, apples and pears for stairs, things like that, plates of meat for feet and all of that sort of thing. Well, people say it's gone out of use. Oh, no, it hasn't. It turned up a few years ago when Barack Obama was around and people talked about, have you got your barracks, meaning your Barack Obamas, meaning your pajamas, you see. Well, anything in the COVID era? Well, I've only come across one. Has anybody heard any others? I mean, the word virus, gosh, how can you have rhyming slang with virus? But somebody in Australia, I think, for the first time identified the singer, Miley Cyrus. And so, you know, have you had the Miley? Means, have you had the Miley Cyrus? Means, have you had the virus? Yeah, lovely piece of rhyming slang. Yeah, I got down that straight away. But the examples I've just given you are the tip of an enormous iceberg, aren't they, really? And collecting them is it's an isolated pastime at the moment. People are collecting these all over the place. But what are you going to do with them? What am I going to do with mine? Oh, if only there were an English project in the world where one could send these things to, where they would have an archive, where you would know, everybody would know that if you come across these nonce formations or these surreal formations and you don't know what to do with them, then send them in. Traditional dictionaries will capture some of them, but they won't capture a lot of the dynamic of these spontaneous, colloquial, informal, non-standard, jocular, often politically rather incorrect coinages. Now, what I don't know is the extent to which global variation is entering into this. As I mentioned before, I don't even know just to what extent other languages are doing the same thing. Is this a typically English pastime? Oh, no. I mean, the French have been coining words in this kind of crazy way for generations. Are they doing it now in relation to COVID? I bet they are, but I don't know. What other languages do you know out there that are doing the same sort of thing? Or other varieties of English? Because this evening we're talking about English rather than languages in general. Are there localisms that are emerging? Are there Australian localisms, for instance, or American localisms, or British ones? I came across one the other day, which is very definitely local to Scotland, I imagine. I mean, people in other parts of the world wouldn't use it because I might not even understand what it meant. But you can probably predict what it is if I tell you the definition. It's a ban on visiting Scottish lakes. What is it? Well, Loch Down, of course. Loch Down. Huh? Lovely, lovely. But localized in that way. Now, are there similar things in other parts of the world? I'm sure there are. Now, in a sense, this is old normal, in that people have been coining like this forever. And some of the coinages have become very, very famous. You know, coinages like blurb coming in the early 20th century. And, you know, they've got into the dictionary, become part of standard English, really. But what we don't know is the extent to which global English is making more use of this kind of culturally restricted neologism making more than ever before. What we do know, of course, is that the vocabulary of a language, any language, English in particular, does not grow in a nice, neat curve or line, graph line like that. No, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down over the centuries. First big explosion of vocabulary in the early Middle English period, when French influenced the language so much and tens of thousands of words came into English compared with what had happened before. And then there was a kind of lull. And then in the Renaissance period and in the 16th century in particular, there was another huge explosion, Latin and Greek and Hebrew and other words, the words of the Renaissance, Italian and Spanish and so on, all coming into the language, more tens of thousands of words coming in. And of course, the Shakespeare period too, and then another lull. And then the Industrial Revolution, huge explosion of scientific and technical vocabulary there, huge late 18th century and throughout the 19th century, really, and then another lull. And we seem now these days to be going through another explosion, not so specifically in relation to any one country, but in relation to the phenomenon of global English. And so that's what I thought it would be interesting to spend a little bit of time talking to you this evening about the new normal that's out there. English spoken around the world. Some recent statistics so that we've got a sense of the totality. The Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, which went into its 3rd edition last year. When I did the first edition of that back in the 1990s, and I did as best as anybody could, a survey of the number of speakers of English around the world, using all the available sources, ringing up the embassies, checking from the British Council and doing how many kids in education studying English, all these criteria, and ended up with a total of 1.5 billion. That's 1,500 million. People who use English around the world. Notice the switch, use English. Nobody has ever calculated specifically the differences between listening and speaking and reading and writing and signing to English in these various countries, but roughly 1.5 billion. That was 1997, was it? I forget when that first edition came out. 1997, I think. And then the second edition comes out in 2003, and I did the same exercise again, and the figure had gone up to 2 billion, 2,000 million, which coincided rather nicely with some other statistics that had come from other scholars, like Tom MacArthur in his Guide to English has 2 billion, and David Graddol in his English Futures survey also had 2 billion. And that's the figure that's been used ever since, but that was 2003 in my case. Well, that's 15 years ago or more. What's my maths? Yeah, 16 years ago. But when I was researching the 3rd edition of SEAL, the English Language Encyclopedia, I thought I'll do the exercise again. So I did as best I could. Bit easier these days with the internet being available to help. And I ended up with a total of 2.3 billion. And I was quite impressed with that because 2 things. First of all, it shows that the spread of English around the world is still going on. But on the other hand, it isn't going on as fast as it used to. Because you see, between 1997 and 2003, those 6, 7, 8 years, where you get 500 million increase, well, in the last 15, 16 years, you'd have expected another billion, wouldn't you, if the same rate of increase had been going on? So we should be talking about 3 billion people speaking English around the world, but we're not. It's 2.3 billion. And even if I'm out by a few 100,000, the point is the curve seems to be flattening a little bit. Why? I have no idea. It may be because there's a reaction against English in some places. It may be that as many people as are likely to want to use English, we're reading the total point. Who knows? I don't know, but there is this flattening. And the fact that the increase is continuing means that when you start looking, not just quantity now, but quality, by which I mean the range of phenomena that are being expressed in English, that's where you see the more interesting growth. Now, what am I talking about? Well, I'm not just talking about, English being used on the radio or in a religious setting or something like that. I'm talking about the world of English literature more than anything else. This is the area where you'd expect to see the greatest development as the poets and the playwrights and the novelists and all the others start to exploit English in their genre, whether they are first language speakers or second language speakers or whatever, it doesn't matter. And that is indeed what I am now beginning to see. Well, I say beginning. I was already seeing it when the 2nd edition came out, but I had just a few examples on my shelves then of the kind of exploitation of English in the service of literature, which is turning up all over the English-speaking world. Of course, Commonwealth literature and things like that have always been around for decades, but this is different. This is a more grassroots kind of development, ordinary people going in for competitions and writing stuff online, self-publishing and things like this in their native variety. Now, let's just remark about the varieties issue, because for some people this will be old hat, and for others it might be something quite new. But remember what happened when English became a global language. It was motivated to do so because of the need for an international lingua franca, motivated in particular by the growth of the independence movements around the world in the second half of the 20th century. The United Nations, with just 50 or so members when it started in the middle of the century, and now 200 odd. And each of these newly independent nations wanting to either retain an earlier kind of English, if they were part of the old colony setup, or to adopt English as a lingua franca because they were aware it was rapidly becoming a global way of communicating. And so you got the phenomenon of people, of countries, taking English into its ambit and doing what with it? Well, think back now to the days when countries like Nigeria and Ghana and Singapore and so on were becoming independent. And all over the English-speaking world, the same kind of reasoning went on. People would say, yes, we're independent now. We're going to have a new government, a new flag, a new this, that, and the other. We need a new language for our country. And so in Nigeria, for instance, to take that example, let's get rid of English. That English is the language of our colonial past, the language of our oppressors. We don't want it anymore. Let's use a local language. But they looked around and found that of the 400 languages spoken in Nigeria, which one should be the national language? And you can sense the anxiety surrounding any such decision-making. So in the end, most of these countries decided that they would stay with English. At least everybody hates it equally, as it were, or better the devil you know. And what happened was that, yes, they carried on with English, but then the magic happened. As they adopted it, they immediately started to adapt it. We shouldn't have been surprised, really, because this is the sort of thing that's happened to English every time it's gone abroad, or indeed, every time it's gone into a different part of the British Isles. The local indigenous population takes English and adapts it into Scots English and Irish English and Welsh English, and of course, American English 500 years ago. Now, the same sort of thing happened immediately in these newly independent nations. I know because I was there. I know that's difficult to believe, but still, in the 1960s, I wrote to as many of the newly independent nations as I could get hold of, either to their embassies or to some cultural attaché or what have you. Asked them, are you collecting new words and new constructions and so on for English in your country? And turned out that several universities in the countries around the world had already begun lexicography projects in which they were collecting the words that were being adapted into their culture. Words to do with myths and legends, fauna and flora, food and drink, the political situation, the religious situation. All of these things were producing, to begin with, quite small dictionary type projects, but over the last 50 years, grown into enormous projects. I mean, it's very typical now to have a dictionary of a English-speaking part of the world, dictionary of South Africa, whatever it might be, 10,000, 15,000 words in it, or words, expressions, idioms, and so on. Look at this big beast here. Look at that. I mean, Dictionary of the English Creole of Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, this is a huge, a wonderful, wonderful collection edited by Lies Weiner. And it's got over 12,000 entries in it, just for Trinidad and Tobago. Or, of course, some of the adjacent islands where some of these words have got into wider circulation. I've got a whole shelf full in the other room of dictionaries of local parts of the world now. Didn't have that 15 years ago. Had one or two, but not as many as there are around now. That Trinidad book came out about 10, 12 years ago. Now, as these local varieties develop, so you get an increasing sense of pride in the local vocabularies that are developing, and an increasing sense of confidence in using the vocabulary on the public stage, by which I mean not just the physical theatre stage, but the public literary stage. So in novels and poems and plays and the like, once upon a time, if somebody dared to use some non-standard English, then there would be a kind of apologetic tone in the writing. There would probably be a gloss or something like that. Some word, he said in his local Creole. In other words, explaining to somebody, to the reader, that you must expect that this is a non-standardism and I don't expect you to understand it. And so I'm not going to give it, or I'm only going to give it in translation. Or if I do give it, I'll give you a translation straight away so that you're not upset. Now, that kind of anxiety about your local variety of English, whatever it is, was very common in the 1960s, 70s, maybe even later. You don't see it now. Or, well, never say never. I hardly ever see it now. What I see now is an increased confidence, a readiness to write a novel or a poem or a play, and to use the local variety of English in its standard and non-standard forms in the characters or in the story, without any apology whatsoever. I've got some examples here to show you. Do you know Suhail Sardi's Psychorag, for instance, a novel that came out about 10 years or so ago? Suhail is a doctor from Glasgow, and he writes the novel in urban Glaswegian, but with his Urdu background. Scattered throughout the novel are all kinds of Urduisms, Urdu expressions. There's Urdu culture throughout the whole thing. It's a great story, and no apology at any point. The words just come in, the sentences come in, and he uses them as part of the plot development and as part of the characterization. Now you say, well, how am I going to understand that bit? Ah, clever, clever. He's got a glossary at the back, you see, of all the Urdu expressions, which you can use if you don't know the word, and you don't have to use if you do know the word. You see, that's the cleverness of it. So that was one of my first examples of of this new confidence, as I'm describing it. But I've got dozens now in there, novels, poems. Here's a poetry thing that comes out every year, actually. I don't know whether you know the Proverse poetry competitions, Proverse, P-R-O-verse, Proverse, from Hong Kong, that Gillian and Werner Bickley introduced a few years ago. They do it every year. Really interesting competition. Bickley, that's B-I-C-K-L-E-Y. Gillian and Werner. And this year's poetry competition is called Mingled Voices. Now, in here, you've got contributions from over 60 people from all over the place. A third of them don't have English as their mother tongue. They're all writing in English. And depending on where they're from, and they're from everywhere, you know, from parts of the Far East, India, Pakistan, all over the place, Hong Kong, Macau, the Philippines, Singapore, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and so on. And they're all writing their poems in English, a third of them without English as a first language, and putting in there lots of local expressions and local culture, perhaps is more to the point, because it's not that the words and the idioms are all in a foreign language or anything, or completely unfamiliar, but the culture comes through. And, some of them are wonderful. What's this one? Oh, Whispering the Family Tree to My Son at Night, from a Hindi writer, Aparna Upadhyaya Sanyal. let me tell you the inside vein secrets of our kin. Here on the soft yellow of my wrist lies the heartbeat of my ancestors. And she goes on, and in the middle, she talks about her daddy and her pardaddy and her nahi, and her, these are all terms for grandparents in Hindi. And they're just used as part of the poem. And at the back, once again, there are some notes where the authors will provide a little bit of help for people who aren't familiar with those things. Great stuff. This is the new normal in literature. People are beginning to be proud of their local varieties of English and their local culture. But you know, you need somebody else as well as the author of these projects in order to develop a real sense of the uniqueness of these different varieties. Here's a typical example. I've used it in the 3rd edition of my English language encyclopedia, so you can look it up there afterwards if you want. But there was a short story written by somebody from Colombia about carnival time in Barranquilla out there. And the writer is aware that writing this story confidently, nonetheless, people may not understand all of it, put some footnotes in at the bottom, explaining some of the terms that are local to the Colombian carnival. Now, I read this story for the first time and I appreciated the notes, but there were several words he didn't gloss, which to him, perhaps he felt, oh, everybody knows this, surely? But no, I didn't know them. And I had to look them up and so on. So here's the point, you see, that when you write something and you want it for a universal audience, you try to help the audience, you need the outsider looking in order to remind you of the uniqueness of your culture, because so much of that uniqueness is just unconscious. You just don't realize that it's there. Now, some examples from British culture to illustrate the point. And all of these examples I've come across in everyday speech, but I've also encountered them as causing problems for people for whom English is a second language, obviously, but actually for whom British English culture is a second or foreign culture. So there's no difference anymore between native speaker and non-native speaker in this respect. Some of these examples I'm going to give you now will be unintelligible unless you know to people for whom English is not a mother tongue, but equally they may well be unintelligible to people from the United States or from Australia or from anywhere else where English is a first language. And an example here that I've looked at, let me just pull out a little file. Yes, this one, I overheard this in a doctor's surgery waiting room in the days when I used to go out into the outside world, perhaps going away a bit. And there was this dialogue going on. Anything wrong, says one person to the other. No, says the other, just an MOT. Oh, good, I had one a month ago. Did you pass? Yes, fine. Just an MOT. Well, there was another dialogue that I came across at last year's IATEFL, I think it was. Anyway, a meeting of teachers of English where I used that example and the person said, so they were talking about their car because they knew what MOT meant. It's in the dictionary after all. MOT stands for Ministry of Transport. People in Great Britain who own a vehicle that is 3 years old are obliged by law to have it tested annually to ensure it's safe and roadworthy and not emitting an excessive amount of gas through the exhaust pipe, you know, all that sort of thing, with just a few exemptions. Now, the name of the test has stayed the same, even though the name of the relevant government ministry was changed. Department of Transport, wasn't it, in 2002 or thereabouts. So typical sentences are going to be, you know, my car has to have its MOT test next week. Have you got the old MOT certificate? Oh, it's passed its MOT or it's failed its MOT. But the people in the doctor's surgery waiting room were not talking about cars. I'm just having an MOT, says the person, meaning I'm having a health checkup. And that meaning had not reached the group of second language learners that I was talking to at this conference last year. And I wonder how many people from outside Britain would understand it without, unless they're really familiar with the culture, I mean, just had an MOT, meaning I'm feeling fine now. And then you look up MOT online and you find that it's being used all over the place in this health checkup kind of sense. Here's 2 or 3 examples I found just earlier on this week when I was thinking of what to say this evening. From a government pensions site headed Midlife MOT, take control of your future. This one from a horticulturist, garden advice, offers a garden MOT. They will come and check your garden for you and make sure all is well. This one from the Sleep Council. Do I need a new bed? Give your bed an MOT. And this one from, I found this one in an older edition of the Telegraph back in 2018. Does your marriage need an MOT? Well, dozens of examples. You'll find them for yourselves. These are things that are not getting into the dictionaries. I was curious. I checked the online OED. Its 3rd edition has revised the entry on MOT, but only the car meaning is in there, not any of these new metaphorical ones. They'll come. But this is an example of what I mean. MOT in a very British kind of local sort of way. People don't think twice about it, and yet outsiders would notice it straight away. Another example, says somebody looking at their garden, it's like painting the 4th bridge. Well, we all know what that means, don't we? Those of us who know what the 4th bridge is and how the story goes, that if you start painting it at one end, by the time you get to the other, it takes so long, you've got to start painting it all over again. But the person in the garden is not talking about painting, he's talking about the weeds growing. So you can collect a whole pile of these. And I've got a collection of, well, a couple of hundred of them actually, just for Britain. Well, I say Britain, just for the Britain that I grew up in. How many of these are generationally transmitted? Do youngsters say things like painting the 4th bridge? I don't know. Certainly one I tried in a school the other, when I used to go into schools. And I used some examples and I said to the class, it was like Clapham Junction in there. Do you know what it means? None of them put their hands up. Any of us over a certain age probably know it very well. Of course, you have to know that Clapham Junction is the busiest railway, or the most chaotic railway station in Britain. So they say, south of London, with more platforms on it than anywhere else. And you always get lost there. So if I say it's like Clapham Junction in there, it means it was chaos in there. But will younger people understand me if I say that? I'm not so sure. And so here we have examples from British culture, which may not travel to other places. And of course, the same thing happens the other way around. So now I'm thinking of my visits to other parts of the English-speaking world where I have failed to understand what's going on. And I'm now thinking, because I happen to have these on my shelf here, of my visit to New Zealand a few years ago, where there was an advertising campaign on behalf of Tui beer. That's T-U-I, Tui beer. It was called a Yeah Right campaign. Yeah, right. Meaning, I don't believe you. You have to have that intonation on it, don't you? I don't believe you. And you would go around and you see these posters all over the place, billboards, and there would be a statement on them, and there would be, yeah, right, at the bottom. And this was a hugely popular advertising campaign, so popular that they produced a whole book of these. It's called the Yeah, Right book, endorsed by the Ministry of Culture. Yeah, right. So you go through these and you put, oh, here we are, look. Of course it's true. Of course it's true. I saw it on CNN. Yeah, right. And there are lots like this. The check is in the mail. Yeah, right. I don't need a map. I never get lost. Yeah, right. Please hold, you're in a priority queue. Yeah, right. That one travels. That one's universal. In fact, the ones I've just given you have traveled. I know what they all mean. But what about this one? Let Paul fly you there. Yeah, right. Well, when I saw this one, I turned to my friend who was walking with and said, what does that mean? And he said, what? You don't know what that means? I say, no, who's Paul? You don't know who Paul is? No, I don't know who Paul is. He couldn't believe it. Paul was Paul Holmes, who is a announcer, a radio personality, television personality, ran the breakfast show. You know, we've all got breakfast show hosts that we all know in our different countries. And everybody knows about Paul. Well, apparently Paul had an airplane and he flew it from A to B and on landing crashed it and survived. And then he got another airplane and flew it from C to D and on landing crashed it and survived. So my friend told me. So let Paul fly you there? Yeah, right. Now, when you go through this, this book and its companion, because it was so successful, another book came out later containing them. Something like 40% of the statements in those posters I cannot understand because they are culturally specific to New Zealand. And here's me, a native speaker of the language, not knowing my own language when I go to New Zealand because of the cultural differences. That's the point, you see. There is now no longer any difference between native and non-native speaker when it comes to cultural identity and cultural uniqueness. So there needs to be a dictionary of these, and there isn't one. I'd love to have a dictionary of all the New Zealandisms that reflect New Zealand culture, South Africanisms reflecting South African culture, Welshisms, Irishisms, Scottishisms, you name it, from whichever part of the world you're looking in from. There is no such thing. And not just English-speaking parts of the world. If I go to Sweden or to France or to Germany, I want examples of Englishisms used by people in those countries when they are speaking English fluently that I will not understand because I do not know the cultural background that is theirs. Now this sort of thing is so widespread for lack of dictionaries. We need an international cultural dictionary, really. No book would be big enough, but it could be done online with different people from different parts of the world. And if there isn't such a dictionary, then one needs some sort of organization to sponsor it. Oh, if only there were an English project which could take the responsibility for doing this sort of thing, organizing people around the world, collecting the stuff, bringing it together. Oh, maybe there will be one day. In the meantime, you see, people send stuff to me because they read my books and they think, oh, I'll send these things to David. I get this all the time. Look, not just international, but national too. Here's somebody not so long ago sent me pages and pages and pages of lists of local dialect words from the Cotswolds and Oxfordshire. They've been collecting them for years. They don't know what to do with them. Where are they going to send them? They send them to me. What am I going to do with them? I want to send them to the English Project. Oh, this one. Oh, this was lovely. Some of Nanny's old sayings. Oh, a lot of them actually are politically very incorrect and a bit rude, so I can't use them all. But oh, his face was all on one side like the handle of a jug. Oh, lovely. Yeah. You've been vaccinated with a gramophone needle. That must be because it looked bad. He's got a voice like a hairy worm. A voice like a hairy worm. Oh, gosh. I mean, I've never heard a worm have a voice. I mean, that's good enough for Shakespeare, it seems to me. Now, Yes, these things need a central place. We need a museum. We need a central area. And the English Project is a perfect example of this. We've been waiting for houses of language for years to come along. They've all failed. The original idea of having a language world in this country collapsed in the late 1990s. There was an idea for a Spanish one which collapsed. The only one that's successful, and watch this space, because next week, a week tomorrow, Wednesday, the 22nd of October, Planet Word is opening in Washington, the first language museum to really succeed, a voice interactive museum, moreover. You can look it up on planetwordmuseum.org, planetwordmuseum.org. That's the only one that's been successful. The second most successful one, I have no doubt, Bill, will be the English Project. Sooner or later, whatever the new normal will be, I hope the English Project will be part of it. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that. Now, at this moment, my colleague Carol is going to turn your videos back on, but please stay muted. Otherwise, we'll have a Babel and cacophony experience. And we've had some fantastic questions already. So I'm going to, whilst you're getting visible again, let me give you the first one, which is actually from someone you know well, David, Edward Fennell here. And by the way, your challenge to us is taken. It's clearly a COVID lingo needing to be made. And with our friends here in Hampshire Cultural Trust, we're making terrific progress about the actual finding of a location and the starting of this museum. But we'll come on to that perhaps later on. So the first question here is, if we look back to another pandemic, to the Great Plague in the 1660s, was this also a moment when new words emerged? And do we have any signposts from the writings of people like Pepys and Defoe?
Oh, well, there's a research project for the research wing of the English Project when it gets built. You have to, my guess is that there would not have been very much initiative along those lines. Why? Because the second half of the 17th century was a period when people started to look back at the century before, 50 to 100 years before, and began to express an appalled view that the English language was going out of control. People like Shakespeare and so on were just inventing words all over the place. And it's really getting a bit ridiculous. And it's time we stopped all this happening. And so you get the beginning of the academy movement in the second half of the 17th century. People like Swift and Dryden wanting to set up 1660, after all, the Science Society. People meeting to try and work out, there was a committee actually set up to try and work out a way of keeping the English language under control. So if there were initiatives of the kind that you mentioned, I think it's very unlikely that there would have been very many. And if there had been, they certainly wouldn't have been given any public presence with that kind of atmosphere around. But who knows? I mean, let's go through Pepys and the others and see what we could bring up.
Great question and great answer. Thank you, David. Number of questions about the way that some language seems to be grouping around various metaphors. And there's a comment here about the language of warfare, whether it's beat the virus or the battle or the front line. And I just wondered whether you think that's surprising or unsurprising, or any thoughts about the way language seems to cluster around things that suggest human attitudes.
Yes, another very interesting angle, but it ties in very nicely with a development in linguistics, which goes back some 20, 30 years now, to a book written by Lakoff and Johnson some years ago called Metaphors We Live By. And their book, and a huge literature that's come out of it, where people examine everyday locutions to see to what extent there is a hidden set of metaphors in there. One of the first examples was argument. what are the words we use to talk about argument? Well, I destroy you, I fight you, and so on. Suddenly you realize there's a whole militaristic vein of metaphorical expression that fuels the concept of having an argument, which people then, once they recognize it, if you want to have a friendly argument, then you have to change your metaphors, you see. And what is a friendly argument? Well, now we're talking about a debate or something like that, where the metaphors are going to be rather different. So huge literature on this now. And I would expect, indeed, one of the current developments to be an analysis of COVID language to see precisely what metaphors are being used. Now, I haven't done this, and so I'm interested to hear that example that you've just given, Bill, or your questioner has just given, because you know, it hadn't occurred to me really. But as soon as you say it, yes, this is exactly the sort of thing we need to do. To what extent are the metaphors that we're using metaphors that will convey a set of attitudes towards the pandemic and how it should be dealt with? And perhaps different cultures will be, and different languages will be using different types of metaphor here. Fascinating research area, this. Yeah.
There's another question, which maybe isn't a question, it's almost more a statement about the use, which others have commented on, sometimes social distance and sometimes physical distance. And they can mean quite different things, and one can feel very cold and unkind, and one can feel just descriptive and a little more rational.
Yes, that's right. I mean, very early on in the pandemic crisis, I tweeted that social distancing was a nonsense term here. The one thing we needed more than anything else was social solidarity. It was physical distancing that we're talking about. Of course, we know where social distancing came from. It's a term in sociology, and it goes back, I believe, the best part of, I looked it up in UED once, you know, you find it in the late 19th century, developing then. And so you can understand why it got extended into the present circumstance. But no, it's physical distancing is what we're all talking about, not social.
And apart from COVID-19, which I think is in the OED, are there other words that you think from the kind of the crop that you were sharing that are likely to make it, or as far as you know, are in the OED at the moment?
I haven't checked, to be honest. I've looked up a few. It takes a while. Lexicographers are notoriously conservative people. They don't get, I mean, otherwise they get into trouble. You know, people will complain bitterly if a word gets in too soon, and if there's, you know, if it's a controversial term. So they wait for a while. Traditional lexicography is very much based on the written language, not the spoken language. And even online language, many lexicographers are a bit suspicious of. So they wait. If you've been into a lexicography office, you'll see the pile of slips, or these days electronic slips, building up and building up. And when it gets to a certain tipping point, then yes, it's going to get in. Now, how long it's going to take for some of the new usages to get in, I've no idea. But let's take examples from, say, text messaging, where expressions like LOL, you know, laughing out loud, arrived in the early 2000s. Well, it was 10 or 15 years, and then LOL gets into the dictionary because it starts to be used in such a wide range. So I would expect, you know, all else being equal, 10 to 15 years really before dictionaries really pick up on this. But having said that, the new normal could change everything. And in order to make sure your dictionary is really up to date, there is perhaps some pressure on lexicographers to put as many of these terms in as possible now.
Here's another question, and you're being very generous, taking things which are kind of real time, and the answer is we may not know this at all, but it's a great question. Which generation of society appears to be most predominantly influencing the current spate of neologisms?
You're right. I don't know. Nobody knows this. I can't even tell you, you know, whether we're talking about age, not just age, but gender, ethnicity, all these variables. It's going to become clearer as sociolinguistic studies get done of the contexts in which these terms are appearing. But this is going to mean a radical shift in the way in which linguists and others do their research. Take the example of corpus. A corpus is a collection of usage, and there are many corpora out there, but nobody has ever, all the big corpora are not sociolinguistically sophisticated in the sense that they weren't controlled for age or social background or ethnicity in particular. You know, we're coming out of a Black Lives Matter period, for example. Where are the ethnic, the corpora of color, if I can put it like that, as opposed to general corpora? None of this has happened. It will happen. And the same thing is applying, I think, to the situation we find ourselves in now, that as people start to collect data on the COVID language situation, then a sociolinguistic perspective will emerge, but I don't know it at the moment.
A few comments that might amuse you and indeed colleagues from the chat. These are words that seem to be appearing at the moment. Coronials for babies born in lockdown, like millennials. That's rather nice. Or COVIDiots for those people that the police might not be pleased to see. This is one from me, actually. I saw the other day on Twitter, hashtag Second Comings, which is a close cousin to comings and goings, not unrelated to a certain special advisor and his possibly unauthorized trip to Durham. Discuss. Conversational corona, words gone viral. And I'm moving my way now down, I think, to a more generic question. And just come right down to, is there any way that we measure how many new or period specific words don't enter a language, i.e. they fizzle out with the circumstances that bred them? How does a linguist approach that kind of conundrum?
Yeah. Well, just before we go on to that, COVIDese is my term for all of this, like Chinese and so on. COVIDese. We need a dictionary of COVIDese. Thanks for that. A couple of those examples I didn't have. How do you know? Well, you don't know, in the sense that most of them are never going to be recorded. We'll never know what they were. They will have come to life and died without anybody knowing. But look at it like this. If you go back to the collections of words that were made 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, words that were new words for the year, you know, or new words of the week, new word of the month. People collect these, and there are plenty of sites online. This month's new words, like the ones you've just mentioned. And these are written down then, or they are collected, and they're sometimes in a book or some document or some research place. Now, if you look back, I'm thinking now of a book I've got in the other room of new words. It's called the Longman Dictionary of New Words, or there was also the Guardian Dictionary of New Words. And at one point, I made a check to see how many of them were still in use. And the answer was about 75%. So something like 25% of the words that were introduced in the 1970s, which is the time of this particular book, are no longer in use. So I can't remember any of them now. Oh, wait a minute. Rachmanism. There was a landlord called Rachman who got into really big bad odor in the press at the time. Everybody talked about Rachmanism for bad landlord practice. Well, you know, what? Hey, Daddy-O. Daddy-O, what? Really? All sorts of words, some of which may still be in use somewhere by some people. You know, never say never with these things. But I would say, as a guess, something like 25% of the new words that come in at any one time are likely never to be permanent fixtures in the language.
Thank you. And just a remark to everybody, we've got another 5 minutes or so. Do put any questions that you may have in the chat. This is another more general linguistic, generic question, really. When can a locally modified English be said to have become a separate and distinct language?
Not on any linguistic grounds. Well, there might be linguistic grounds. There are two criteria. The usual one is mutual unintelligibility. So when a variety becomes so unintelligible in writing as well as in speech, because obviously if it's just speech, you might just have a very broad accent and not understand anybody, you know. But in writing as well as in speech, then you'd say it had become a different language. And perhaps the famous example of this is Tok Pigeon in Papua New Guinea, which is a pidgin English, historically derived from English, but mutually unintelligible to any of us. If you read the Bible in Tok Pigeon or Shakespeare in Tok Pigeon, you don't understand it really. So there are some linguistic cases, but the vast majority are socially or culturally or politically or economically motivated. In other words, if you have a variety of English and you're powerful enough to say, our variety is a different language, it's not just a dialect anymore, well, power speaks and away you go, you know. So there have been some movements which have tried to do this. None have been particularly successful, but amongst a group of the population, they are still thought of as separate languages. And the two examples that come immediately to mind are Ebonics in the United States for Black vernacular English, which was traditionally seen as a variety, a dialect, but there was a strong movement to say, no, it's more than that, it's just a language. This movement died away a bit, but it might resurface now, given the current mood. And nearer to home, of course, there's Scots, where there are quite a large number of people in Scotland who say that Scots, I'm not talking about Scots Gaelic, which is a Celtic language, I'm talking about the English language used in Scotland, which is so distinctive, the language of Robbie Burns, if you like, and all the subsequent developments from it, is so different that it's a different language. So there is a mood up there. Some people say Scots is a different language. Some people say it isn't, so it's very controversial. But you're not going to get anywhere unless you've got the power behind it to be able to say, our language, our variety is a different language now. And I suppose the most famous example of this happening in recent times is in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, where once upon a time there was varieties of Serbo-Croatian in Croatia and Serbia and so on. And now they're different languages. Why? Because the countries are independent and they've got the power to make it so.
So one more, possibly two more questions, David. And this one has been repeated. So it's a very clever chat technique because I've missed it. Or maybe it suggests visually that the questioner has attitude. But here we go. In a world where visually mediums are becoming increasingly popular, in a world where visual mediums are becoming more popular and the human populace is becoming more reliant on technology and dumber for it, what place will the future hold for literature, neologisms, and the advancement of language? So have a go at that, David.
Well, I'm certainly not a prophet of doom in this respect. I've been observing as best I can the development of language in relation to technology over the last, since it started to come in, you know, since the early 1990s, really, for most of us, the internet and everything. When did you first send an email, Bill? Probably not until the middle of the 1990s. You know, this is a fairly recent thing. So it's too early to say what the long-term effects of technology are going to be. But the prophets of doom are out there saying it's going to be a disaster and things are going to get worse and worse. I don't see it, frankly. If you take a representative sample of all the languages on the internet at the moment, and people are doing this in building up corpora of internet stuff, but language isn't that different from what it was before the internet came along. There have been a few new words, you know, a few thousand new words, but English has over 1 million words. Who knows how many words English has got? So 5,000 to 10,000 new ones to do with the internet are neither here nor there. New grammatical constructions? No, I don't think so. New spellings? A few. New punctuation devices? A few, yes. But these are marginal things. The bulk of the language is carrying on in the same way as it ever was, whether it's online or offline. So what I see is an increase in the expressive richness of the language, where new varieties are coming along, new styles, Twitter style, Facebook style, or styles, plural, or whatever, which are taking the language in new directions. But if you say influencing the language that is already there, well, no. I mean, how often do you find a word that's actually come off the internet into everyday speech? LOL was one, yes, and you used one a few minutes ago. Hashtag, that's another. All right, give me a third, and you might be able to give me a third and a fourth and a fifth and maybe a dozen or two. But we're talking trivia here. You know, these are minor developments on language as a whole. Now, never say never. In the long term, maybe there will be more fundamental developments that will affect English or any language as a whole. But at the moment, I don't see it.
David, that's a lovely positive note for me to pause on. And I'm going to pass in a second to my colleague, Nick Lodge, who just wants to say a few words of thanks. But I just want to say to everybody listening and watching today, thank you very much. And thank you for your generosity, because this has been a fundraising evening for us. And special thank you to David on that too. If there is anything that you'd like to engage with us on, we'll send you an email after this via the Eventbrite system, and that's a perfect opportunity to do that. And I apologize to those of you who've sent me questions that I've either been too stupid or too slow to read out. They can be saved, so we can have those too. So with no more ado, let me pass to Nick Lodge, fellow trustee, to just close this session.
David, it has been can you hear me, just to check?
Thank you.
David,
Yes.
it's been an enormous pleasure this evening to listen to your brilliantly observed discussion and your brilliantly amusing discussion, and to give us an insight into your own private notebook on COVID has been wonderful and absolutely excellent. I think also that the talk that you've made about the confusion about different English is something that is something that's affected me a lot too. I spent some time in India, and although we think we speak the same language, it's really been diverging since 1947, and so many wonderful misunderstandings I think can occur there. I must just throw in one of my own terms. Most interesting one I think I've heard. I was listening to a lady from the World Health Organization talking, and she discussed the concept of respiratory etiquette. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, something that Debrets certainly haven't really got their fingers into yet. And to think that this is not just about the way we might use a knife and fork, this is about the way we breathe. So respiratory etiquette, I think, is one for you. So as Bill said, thank you very much for a fascinating evening. It's been really wonderful to hear your views on COVID and the language generally, the new normal and where things are going. So, and thank you too for allowing us to use it for fundraising this evening. We're all very grateful, and I'd just like to speak on behalf of everybody and in thanking you for this. I don't think we'll be able to clap because we're all muted, but we'll be able to
take yourself off mute if you want to. Now,
okay.
Now I give you permission.
Okay, here we go. Big round of applause for David. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, these days there's a little symbol, isn't there, that you can use if you're applauding, or you can put your thumbs up or thumbs down and all the rest of it. Now, it's been an absolute delight, Bill, Nick, and thanks everybody for supporting the project in the way you have. All I can say is thank you and all power to you.
Thank you so much, David. The chat is full of thank yous and lovely comments to you. So thank you too to your wife and friend of ours, Hilary, for enabling some of the technical things at your end, and to my colleague Carol in Winchester. Without more ado, thank you, friends. Good night, and COVID lingo.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.